On the evening of April 21st, 2026, the American political landscape presented a striking paradox. In two separate Republican contests held simultaneously across the country, President Donald Trump's political influence yielded dramatically different outcomes, exposing deep fissures within the Republican Party that could reshape the upcoming midterm elections. In Alabama, candidates endorsed by President Trump achieved overwhelming victories in the Republican Senate primary, securing an average of 80.2% of the vote. In Cullman County, support for Trump's endorsed candidates reached as high as 85%, demonstrating the continued strength of the president's base in the Deep South. These margins represent some of the most dominant primary performances in modern Republican politics, with Alabama Republicans turning out in substantial numbers to support candidates aligned with the Trump agenda. The Alabama results confirm what political observers have long understood about the region. The Deep South remains the bedrock of Trump's political support. Alabama has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since Jimmy Carter in 1976, making Republican primaries the decisive contest for federal offices. The magnitude of Trump's endorsement power in this context suggests that in solidly Republican territory, the president maintains nearly unchallengeable influence over primary voters. However, the political narrative shifted dramatically just hours later when results arrived from Minnesota's 5th Congressional District special election. There, a Trump-aligned Republican candidate suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of an establishment Republican opponent named Ryan. The final margin stood at 65% to 20%, a 45-point gap that political analysts described as remarkable for an intra-party contest. The Minnesota result carried particular significance because it occurred in precisely the type of competitive territory that Trump needs to maintain Republican competitiveness in national elections. Minnesota, while historically leaning Democratic in presidential contests, contains substantial Republican support in rural areas and has been targeted by Republican strategists seeking to expand the party's electoral map. Trump's 2016 and 2020 campaigns made notable inroads with working-class voters in the state, particularly in regions such as the Iron Range and manufacturing communities. The simultaneous occurrence of these two contests, one demonstrating overwhelming Trump loyalty, the other revealing significant rejection of Trump-aligned candidates, created what political strategists immediately recognized as a defining moment of the 2026 election cycle. Social media platforms rapidly circulated split-screen graphics contrasting the Alabama and Minnesota results, with commentators describing the phenomenon as evidence of a bipolar base within Republican politics. Political scientists note that such divergent results within the same 24-hour period under the same national political conditions suggest structural rather than circumstantial factors at work. The Alabama-Minnesota divide points to a Republican coalition increasingly split between deeply loyal base voters in solidly Republican territory and more independent-minded voters in competitive states who appear to be reassessing their relationship with Trump-style politics. The White House responded to these mixed results through President Trump's social media platform, where the president characterized both outcomes as victories. The administration emphasized the Alabama results while dismissing the Minnesota defeat as anomalous, attributing it to local factors and candidate quality rather than broader political trends. Yet Democratic campaign operatives moved quickly to capitalize on the Minnesota result. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee issued a memorandum highlighting what it termed Trump toxicity in the Midwest, arguing that voters in competitive states are rejecting the president's political brand and policy agenda. This messaging, Democratic strategists hope, can be deployed across multiple competitive districts in the approaching midterm elections. The central question emerging from April 21st concerns whether these simultaneous results represent a temporary electoral anomaly or the beginning of a structural realignment within Republican politics. For a party seeking to maintain congressional majorities and advance its legislative agenda, understanding the nature of this divide and its underlying causes will prove essential to navigating the challenging political terrain ahead. To comprehend the significance of the April 21st primary results, one must examine the distinct political, economic, and cultural characteristics that differentiate Alabama from Minnesota, and how recent national developments have affected voters in these regions differently. Alabama's political landscape reflects decades of Republican consolidation in the Deep South. The state's electorate is characterized by strong evangelical Christian influence, cultural conservatism, and a sense of economic and cultural alienation from coastal metropolitan centers. Alabama voters have historically perceived Trump as a political figure who directly addresses their concerns regarding national identity, religious values, and resistance to perceived elite condescension. The economic profile of Alabama also shapes its political orientation. While the state has pursued industrial development, including automotive manufacturing and aerospace facilities, many voters continue to feel overlooked by national economic policy. Trump's messaging regarding economic nationalism, trade protectionism, and opposition to globalization resonates strongly with voters who believe previous administrations neglected their communities. Furthermore, Alabama's media consumption patterns and information ecosystems differ substantially from those in competitive Midwestern states. Voters in the Deep South often encounter political information through channels that reinforce, rather than challenge, pro-Trump narratives, creating what media researchers describe as relatively insulated political environments where national controversies may register differently than in more politically heterogeneous regions. Minnesota presents a contrasting political profile. The state maintains a tradition of progressive populism, exemplified by figures such as Hubert Humphrey and Paul Wellstone, while simultaneously containing significant conservative constituencies in rural and exurban areas. The state's suburban voters, particularly in the Twin Cities metropolitan region, tend to be highly educated and politically engaged, often swinging between parties based on candidate quality and specific policy concerns. Trump's previous electoral success in Minnesota derived from his ability to attract working-class voters who had historically supported Democratic candidates, particularly in manufacturing and mining communities. His 2016 campaign messaging emphasized economic revitalization, trade renegotiation, and opposition to establishment politics, positions that appealed to voters experiencing economic displacement in the industrial sector. However, recent national developments appear to have strained this fragile coalition. Policy decisions and events during Trump's second term have created specific grievances among Minnesota's electorate that differ from concerns in the Deep South. The closure of manufacturing facilities, including defense production plants in the Midwest, has directly affected communities that Trump previously promised to protect. Rising utility costs in certain regions have burdened households already facing economic pressure. Military engagements and foreign policy decisions have generated concern among families with substantial representation in the armed forces. The Iran policy trajectory has proven particularly consequential. Trump's oscillating positions regarding Middle East engagement, shifting between aggressive rhetoric and negotiated settlements, have confused voters who expected consistent approaches to international conflict. Military families in the Midwest, disproportionately represented in service branches, have expressed fatigue with prolonged deployments and unclear strategic objectives. Similarly, economic promises regarding manufacturing renaissance have encountered implementation challenges. While some industrial sectors have expanded, others have contracted, creating uneven economic outcomes that vary significantly by region. The closure of the Lima tank manufacturing facility, located in the Midwest, exemplified for many voters the gap between campaign promises and policy delivery. Electricity costs have emerged as an unexpected political issue. The concentration of artificial intelligence data centers in certain Midwestern states has strained regional power grids, contributing to utility rate increases that burden residential consumers. Voters experiencing 30 to 40% increases in electricity bills connect these economic pressures to policy decisions regarding energy infrastructure and industrial development. These regionally specific grievances help explain why identical national events produce divergent political responses. Deep South voters, insulated from certain economic disruptions and prioritizing cultural and identity concerns, maintain loyalty to Trump's political brand. Midwestern voters, experiencing direct economic consequences and valuing pragmatic governance, demonstrate increasing willingness to consider alternative Republican candidates. The 15% decline in MAGA-aligned support documented in recent purple state polling reflects these accumulated pressures. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and similar competitive states, this shift could translate into hundreds of thousands of voters reconsidering their partisan alignment. When aggregated across multiple battleground states, such movement constitutes a potentially decisive electoral force. The structural divide revealed by the April 21st primary results carries profound implications for Republican strategy in the 2026 midterm elections, potentially reshaping congressional maps and legislative possibilities for the remainder of Trump's second term. The fundamental mathematical challenge confronting Republicans stems from the geographic distribution of their support. While dominant performances in Deep South primaries secure Republican nominations in safe seats, these victories do not contribute to expanding congressional majorities. The competitive districts that determine House and Senate control reside primarily in Midwestern, Northeastern, and Sunbelt states, where the April 21st results suggest Trump-aligned candidates face increasingly hostile electoral environments. Political analysts have begun modeling the potential consequences of sustained MAGA support erosion in purple states. In Pennsylvania, with approximately 8.5 million registered voters, a 15% shift away from Trump-aligned candidates could displace over 1 million voters from previous Republican coalitions. Similar calculations apply in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, states that collectively determine presidential electoral outcomes and Senate control. The Minnesota special election result provides empirical evidence that these polling trends are translating into actual voting behavior. Unlike survey responses, which may reflect temporary dissatisfaction, primary election participation indicates committed electoral engagement. The 45-point margin in Minnesota's 5th district suggests that Republican voters in competitive territory are actively seeking alternatives to Trump-aligned candidates, rather than merely expressing passive disapproval. This dynamic creates strategic dilemmas for Republican incumbents in competitive districts. Those maintaining close alignment with the Trump administration risk alienating the independent and moderate voters necessary for general election success. Those distancing themselves from the president face potential primary challenges from MAGA-aligned opponents, jeopardizing their nominations. Either approach entails substantial political risk in an environment of shifting voter loyalties. The establishment Republican victor in Minnesota, Representative Ryan, navigated this terrain by emphasizing traditional conservative principles, fiscal responsibility, strong national defense, and institutional respect, without directly confronting the Trump brand. This approach attracted 65% of Republican primary voters, suggesting substantial appetite for what might be termed governance conservatism, distinct from movement conservatism. Republican donors and party institutions are closely monitoring these developments. The Minnesota result suggests that traditional conservative candidates can succeed in competitive territory without embracing the confrontational style and cultural politics associated with Trump's approach. This vindication of establishment republicanism may encourage additional candidates to pursue similar strategies, potentially increasing primary challenges to Trump-aligned incumbents in swing districts. The Democratic Party's strategic response to these Republican divisions will significantly influence the midterm landscape. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee's messaging, emphasizing Trump toxicity, aims to nationalize local races, making every competitive contest a referendum on presidential leadership. This approach, if successful, could allow Democratic candidates to benefit from Republican divisions without necessarily offering detailed policy alternatives. However, Democrats face their own challenges in capitalizing on Republican fractures. The party must simultaneously attract disaffected Republican moderates without alienating progressive base voters who demand ambitious policy agendas. Navigating this coalition management will require delicate positioning on issues ranging from economic policy to cultural questions. The White House's strategic response to these electoral warning signs remains a subject of intense speculation. The administration could attempt to moderate its messaging and policy priorities to regain Midwestern support, though such shifts might alienate the Deep South base that provides Trump's most reliable support. Alternatively, the administration might double down on base mobilization strategies, accepting reduced competitiveness in purple states in exchange for maintaining core coalition intensity. Historical precedents for managing such coalition tensions offer limited guidance. Previous presidents facing midterm challenges have typically attempted to broaden their appeal through policy moderation, though Trump's distinctive political style and communication methods may render conventional approaches ineffective. The administration's reliance on social media messaging and direct base communication creates different strategic options than those available to previous administrations. The congressional agenda for the remainder of 2026 will inevitably reflect these electoral calculations. Legislative priorities that might jeopardize competitive district Republicans, controversial immigration measures, expansive executive actions, or confrontational oversight may face increased internal party resistance as members prioritize their individual electoral survival over collective agenda advancement. The Alabama-Minnesota divide represents more than a temporary electoral snapshot. It signals potential long-term transformations in Republican Party identity, coalition composition, and American political governance that may extend well beyond the 2026 election cycle. The consolidation of Trump's base in the Deep South, while simultaneously losing ground in competitive states, creates what political scientists term a density versus distribution problem. High levels of support concentrated in non-competitive states provide impressive popular vote totals and primary victories, but contribute inefficiently to congressional majorities and electoral college success. The Republican coalition's increasing geographic concentration, if continued, could produce persistent structural disadvantages in national elections, despite maintaining substantial aggregate support. This structural challenge resembles dynamics previously encountered by the Democratic Party, whose urban concentration similarly creates electoral college inefficiencies. The Republican Party's potential transition from a geographically dispersed coalition to a regionally concentrated one would represent a fundamental inversion of historical party characteristics with unpredictable long-term consequences. The ideological content of Republican politics also hangs in the balance. The Trump-era emphasis on populist nationalism, cultural confrontation, and economic protectionism has largely supplanted the party's previous focus on limited government, free markets, and international engagement. The Minnesota results suggest that substantial Republican constituencies continue to value traditional conservative governance approaches, creating potential for intra-party ideological contestation. Should establishment Republicans in competitive districts continue succeeding electorally, the party may experience gradual reversion toward pre-Trump conservative orthodoxy, at least in certain regions. This would not necessarily require explicit repudiation of Trump or his agenda, but would involve selective emphasis on different conservative priorities and stylistic approaches. Such evolution would resemble previous party transformations following disruptive political moments. The media and information environments shaping Republican politics further complicate these dynamics. The fragmented contemporary media landscape allows different Republican constituencies to inhabit virtually separate political realities, consuming information that reinforces divergent perspectives on administration performance and national priorities. This epistemic fragmentation makes coalition maintenance increasingly challenging as shared factual foundations erode. For American governance, the Republican divide carries significant institutional implications. A party simultaneously dominating safe seats while struggling in competitive districts may experience increased difficulty maintaining congressional majorities, leading to more frequent divided government and legislative gridlock. The policy stability or instability resulting from such arrangements depends substantially on whether divided government produces moderation or simply paralysis. The 2026 midterm elections will provide crucial evidence regarding whether April 21st represented an anomalous evening or the beginning of sustained political realignment. Special elections occurring throughout the spring and summer will offer additional data points regarding voter behavior in competitive territory. Republican primary contests across multiple states will reveal whether the Minnesota pattern of establishment success repeats or proves unique to local circumstances. Political professionals in both parties are currently recalibrating their strategic assumptions based on these early indicators. Democratic targeting decisions, resource allocation, and messaging development all incorporate the hypothesis that Trump-aligned candidates face heightened vulnerability in competitive states. Republican recruitment efforts, candidate positioning, and primary intervention strategies must similarly account for the apparent divergence between base and swing voter preferences. The ultimate resolution of these tensions will likely extend beyond any single election cycle. Political coalitions rarely transform abruptly. Rather, they evolve through accumulated individual decisions by candidates, donors, activists, and voters. The April 21st results represent one such decision point, signaling to political actors that alternative paths may exist within Republican politics. For observers of American democracy, these developments merit careful attention regardless of partisan orientation. The health of democratic institutions depends substantially on the existence of competitive elections and the capacity of parties to adapt to changing voter preferences. A Republican Party simultaneously demonstrating intense base loyalty and swing voter rejection presents both opportunities and challenges for Democratic representation. The coming months will reveal whether the apparent Republican fracture deepens or begins healing. The administration's policy choices, communication strategies, and political interventions will substantially influence this trajectory. Similarly, the responses of Republican elected officials, candidates, and institutional leaders will determine whether the party pursues coalition expansion or consolidation. What remains clear is that American politics in 2026 enters a period of unusual fluidity and uncertainty. The stable partisan alignments that characterize recent decades show signs of potential rearrangement, with consequences that extend from congressional committee assignments to Supreme Court nominations to the policy framework governing daily life. Understanding these dynamics and their regional variations provides essential context for interpreting the political developments that will unfold in the months ahead. The Alabama and Minnesota results, viewed together, tell a story of a political coalition at an inflection point, capable of remarkable dominance in favorable terrain, yet increasingly vulnerable where national elections are decided. How Republican leaders respond to this challenge, and whether they can bridge the apparent divide between their base and swing constituencies, will shape not only the 2026 elections, but the broader trajectory of American political development in the years to come.